In 2010, 33 Chilean copper miners were trapped by a mine explosion and only rescued after being underground for 69 days. The story made worldwide news. It was an astounding feat. It set the record for survival underground. But the miners were actually discovered in their survival shelter after 17 days, and rescuers were able to drill a shaft with which they could provide them with food and water, which means that they had a level of support that two women and two children trapped after an avalanche in the Piedmont region of Italy in 1755 did not have. And their survival is an extraordinary story that is almost beyond belief. On a map of the Piedmont region of Italy, you can find the commune of Demonte, a municipality of some 2,000 people that is described as being surrounded by the Italian Alps. The name of the town, De Monte, is an Italian family name that means on the mountain. What you won't find on a map today is the hamlet of Bergamoletto. No such village exists today, but it once did, as described by Ignazio Somis, professor of physics at the University of Turin and physician to the Sardinian Majesty Charles Emmanuel in 1768. In the neighborhood of De Monte, as one descends through the upper valley of Stura, on the left hand, about an hour and a half distant from the road leading to the castle of De Monte, towards the middle of the mountain, there were some houses in a place called by its inhabitants Bergamoletto. The mountain living is, according to Somas, apparently quite healthy, noting that people there, for the greater part, though deprived of the numerous conveniences and comforts of life enjoyed in great towns and even in the villages of the flat country, live perfectly satisfied with their lot, are strong, hardy, and generally long-lived. He notes that a man named Anthony Bertolotti died there about 10 years previous at the age of 112. But the same mountain air that produces such long life can also take it, as Somas notes. Now it was from the summit of the forementioned mountains that fell the avalanches of snow, which did so much mischief and almost entirely destroyed the hamlet of Bergamoletto. He explained, on the 19th of March in the morning, there being a great deal of snow, the houses of Bergamoletto were entirely overwhelmed and ruined by two vast bodies of snow. Avalanches, described in the U.S. National Weather Service as a rapid flow of snow down a hill or mountainside, kill an average of 150 people worldwide annually. The United States Forest Service's National Avalanche Center notes that avalanches can quickly reach speeds up to 100 miles per hour. They vary in destructive power from harmless to large enough to destroy mature forests or flatten villages. National Geographic explains that a snow avalanche begins when an unstable mass of snow breaks away from a slope. The snow picks up speed as it moves downhill, producing a river of snow and a cloud of icy particles that rises high into the air. The moving mass picks up even more snow as it rushes downhill. A large, fully developed avalanche can weigh as much as 1,000,000 tons. It can travel faster than 320 kilometers or 200 miles per hour. An avalanche is one of the most powerful events in nature. A fractured mass of snow may flow down a slope or become airborne. As a large avalanche speeds down a mountainside, it may compress the air below it, producing a powerful wind that can blow a house apart, breaking windows, splintering doors, and tearing off the roof. Avalanches strike suddenly and can be deadly. In 1970, a massive avalanche of rocks and ice destroyed the town of Yungay, Peru, killing 18,000 people. Avalanches, of course, are most common and most dangerous in mountainous areas, for example, along the Alps of northwest Italy. In fact, Piedmont, the second largest region in Italy after Sicily, means roughly at the foot of the mountains. Avalanches can certainly be deadly in Piedmont. Last year, 5 skiers in the Piedmont region were caught in an avalanche and 3 were killed after. The Associated Press writes, being dragged downhill for several hundred meters, suffering fatal injuries. Somas would have understood. He wrote, by applying what we thus see daily happen in regard to snowballs to the case at hand, we may easily conceive how a heap of snow may, in its fall, encase to such a degree as to form a avalanche capable of overwhelming a vast number of houses. In fact, the conditions were particularly conducive to avalanches in the area at the time. Somas writes that it began to snow in early March, and the fall increased so much on the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th that many of the inhabitants began to apprehend, and not without reason, that the weight of that which had already fallen might crush their houses, built with stones peculiar to the country, cemented by nothing but mud. The snow on his roof, surprisingly, saved the life of Joseph Rocha, a man of about 50, and his son James, a lad of 15. The two were on the roof of their house to remove snow in order to lessen the weight on it and thereby prevent its destruction. warned by a village priest who perceived a noise towards the top of the mountains, and turning his trembling eyes towards the quarter from which he thought it came, discovered two avalanches driving headlong towards the village. Joseph and James fled as hard as they could towards the church. Somas writes the tragic story. The poor man had scarce advanced 40 steps when, hearing his son fall just at his heels, he turned to assist him, and taking him up, saw the spot on which his house, his stable, and those of some of his neighbors stood, covered in a huge heap of snow, without the least sign of either walls or roofs. It was more than the loss of his house. His wife Mary Ann, his sister Anne, her 11-year-old daughter Margaret, and 2-year-old son Antony had all been at the now buried house. Somas writes, such was his agony at the loss in an instant, his wife, his sister, his family, and all the little he had saved with many years' increasing labor and economy, that hale and hearty as he was, he immediately, as if heaven and earth had come together, lost his senses, swooned away, and tumbled upon the snow. His weren't the only losses. Writing in a 2022 edition of the journal Wilderness and Environmental Medicine, Dr. Raymond Lecker of the military hospital in Ulm, Germany, explains that the heavy snowfall that season caused 200 fatalities in the Maritime Alps. The March 19, 1755 avalanche at Bergamoletto deposited snow approximately 18 meters, nearly 60 feet, deep over the hamlet, causing 22 deaths. Among those lost was the priest who had given Joseph his warning. It was not the avalanche, though, that made the story of Joseph Ruccia so extraordinary. Rather, Gianpaolo Facino of the Department of Humanities of the University of Eastern Piedmont explained in a 2019 paper presented to the Meetings for the Study of Alpine Traditions, the avalanche that buried the hamlet, although tragic and exceptional, does not differ much from similar avalanches if it were not for the story of 3 women who, buried in a small stable, were freed, still alive, the following April 25th, after a long night that lasted 37 days. You see, you cannot tell the story of the avalanche without the story of survival, a story particularly extraordinary given the nature of the event. As Somas writes, 22 persons were buried under this vast mass of snow, which was 60 English feet in height, insomuch that many men who were ordered to give them all possible assistance despaired of being able to do them the least service. As Joseph and James were running for the church, Somas writes that the 3 women had been standing at the door of Joseph's stable, where they had been attending to a goat who was delivering a new kid. They were, he writes, looking at the people throwing snow off from the houses and waiting for the ringing of the bell that was to call them to prayers. But before they could set out, they heard the priest cry out, and raising their trembling eyes saw the avalanches set off, which made her retreat back quickly with her family and shut the door of the stable. The stable, Somas explains, was built with stones, with a roof comprised of thin stone not unlike slate and a pitch sufficient to carry off the rain. The stable housed 6 goats, some hens, a donkey, and also included a bed and some provisions, in order to sleep in bad weather without being obligated to go for anything to the dwelling house. As they threw themselves into the barn to avoid the avalanche, they heard a great part of the roof give way and some stones fall to the ground, and found themselves involved on all sides with a pitch darkness. Unable to hear sounds of rescue, they set themselves to grope about the stable, but without being able to meet with anything but solid snow. They found the door, but beyond it was an impenetrable wall of snow. They called out, but heard no response. They found the manger, which was full of hay, about 20 inches broad, and against a wall supported by an arch that thus enabled it to withstand the shock, and they decided to take up quarters there till it should please the Almighty to send them assistance. They had a kettle which could catch melting snow to drink. Somas explains, in the situation the good women continued for many hours, every moment expected to be relieved from it, but at last, being too convinced that they had no immediate relief to expect, began to consider how they might support life. Anne was carrying a few chestnuts, which they ate for the first 2 days. One of the goats was used for milk, another was expecting a kid. They tried to find supplies in the spare room, but the door was stuck, and they were afraid that trying to pry it open might cause the roof to collapse. They could only guess the passage of time, and day and night, by the clucking of the hens. After what they reckoned to be 10 days surviving on goat's milk and snow for water, the little boy, Antony, began to complain of stomach pains. They comforted him as best they could. On the 12th day he died in his mother's arms. She burst out into a flood of tears, which from her cheeks trickled down on the face of her dead child, whom with repeated kisses she fain would have brought him to life again. The death of this poor child proved the severest trial that the 3 women, the 2 eldest especially, had to suffer during their long confinement. And from this unfortunate day, the fear of death, which they considered at no great distance, began to haunt them more and more. The conditions were awful. The little nourishment which the goat yielded the poor women had made them suffer greatly. They were besides numbed, or rather frozen, with the intense cold. Add to this the necessary but inconvenient tormenting posture of their feet, knees, and every other part of their bodies. The snow, which melting over their heads perpetually trickled down their backs, so that their clothes, their whole bodies, were perfectly drenched with it. The stench arising from it, from the dead bodies and their own and goats' excrement, were such that they were often at the point of swooning away with it. The thoughts that in all this time no one had been at the pains to look for and relieve them, the consideration that all they hereto suffered was nothing in comparison to what they had to suffer before they could recover their liberty, or sink under the weight of all the evils which encompassed them. Slowly the chickens stopped clucking. They considered to try to find them for food, but determined that they had no way to remove the feathers, and that the meat was likely spoiled. The goats were able to climb to the top of the manger and get hay from the loft, but slowly the nursing goat stopped producing milk. When the pregnant goat finally delivered, they killed the kid so it wouldn't drink her milk. They split the small amount of meat from the newborn kid. But the goat giving birth brought a little bit of hope, as they knew when the mother would be about due, and the birth meant that they had survived into the middle of April, and there was hope of a thaw. But the goats ran out of fodder, the milk dried up, and they too died. But where was rescue? After the avalanche, men from the surrounding area were sent to help, gathering eventually 300 men. Among those were Anthony and Joseph Bruno, Marianne's brothers, who came from Piedmont. The rescuers tried probing with iron bars to find the roofs of houses, but the snow was too deep and packed too hard, them finding that it was throwing away their time and trouble to no purpose. Enough time passed that they assumed that no one would have survived, and the men had to wait till the weather growing milder, the melting of the snow should give Joseph the opportunity of paying the last duty to his family. The pack melted slowly, and the attempt to recover remains didn't resume until April 18th. They began digging and finding homes. They recovered the body of the priest, Di Giulio Emmanuel, with beads in his hand. Joseph Rocha, animated by these discoveries, set himself with new spirits about discovering the situation of his house and the stable belonging to it, and with spades and iron crows made several wide and deep holes in the snow, throwing great quantities of earth in them, earth mixed with water being very powerful in destroying the strong cohesion of snow and ice. He and James were working when his brothers-in-law returned. Anthony Bruno had had a dream that his sister, with an earnestness mixed with grief and hope, called upon him, telling him, "God has kept me alive. Hasten, therefore, to my assistance." The men found the house, but it was empty. Then they set out to find the stable. Pushing a bar through snow, they heard a hoarse and languid voice. "Help, my dear husband! Help, my dear brother! Help!" The husband and brother were thunderstruck. Lechner writes that when the 3 survivors were dug out, their clothes were rotted. They were disfigured with louse-bitten skin, and they were exhausted and unable to stand or walk because of swollen and contracted limbs. But he concludes, this case demonstrates that people can overcome extremely adverse conditions and can survive. The unlikely survival of Anna Bruno, her daughter Margaret, and her sister-in-law Anne-Marie Fauche after 37 days is what Ficino calls perhaps the only historically documented of this duration. To the extent that it's even talked about today, it's usually in medical journals talking about the conditions that they suffered as a result of their confinement, including what some describe as the first documented case of what today we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. All 3 women were still alive when Somis wrote his book, which was originally published in 1758. Anna and Margaret were described as being in perfect health, although Anne-Marie, he said, was unable to work owing to a great dimness of vision. Somis's work is largely a scientific work for its time. He tested how much weight that the beam on the barn could hold. He tested whether chickens can actually tell if it's day or night, even if they're just stuck in the dark. But in the end, he appealed to another power to explain their unlikely survival, writing simply that the Lord was with them. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.